Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for us to hold this seminar in partnership with Yale University and combining it with the annual Global Justice Program Conference at Yale and bringing in this extremely important perspective on how we look at Indian thought process, Indian perspectives on innovation-related incentives. How we bring in this huge delicate balance that is needed in terms of access to technology, which is the broad objective of the public policy making, and also incentivize those who are actually contributing in the research, namely the private sector. And that's where the conflict comes in, how we create global public goods without disincentivizing the actual innovation channels that are there. And that's where this delicate balancing need is there. RIS has been participating with Thomas Pogge and the group led by him and Professor Adam Hollis. They have been doing amazing work in terms of how health impact fund can be leveraged. And then we explored the idea and its applicability for other sectors. It is not confined to health alone. I myself had worked on its relevance and application for agriculture sector. And today we thought we would also explore the idea for the climate change debate. What kind of debates are there in terms of access to technology, how we can address participation of developing countries and least developed countries for access to technology. As we were hearing Mr. Rashmi, the debate at Glasgow is still on in terms of finance and access to finance. But finance is largely in terms of also access to technology, about the mitigation and also about bringing in inclusion in the whole process. So the whole concept of access, equity, and inclusion when it comes to technology is important for the developing countries. South-South cooperation, cooperation for finance, and also cooperation for futuristic partnerships. They are important. And that's where the larger challenge lies. How we can form a sort of consortium, chip in with our few pennies together, and see a larger fund that can reward the company, the institutions. Idea is not just to bring in public sector alone. We have seen this in many countries that no one actor can really deliver. The convergence has to happen. The convergence has to happen in terms of the larger gains. And for that, we thought one of the best possibilities is to have a chair who is actually understanding and appreciating this. And I'm so privileged to welcome Shri Surjeet Kumar, Honorable Member of Parliament, Member Rajya Sabha in India, to chair this session. He was earlier advisor to the Honorable Chief Minister of Odisha, and he himself has specialized in law. He has been practicing. He was also part of the World Economic Forum, was connected with the UNDP, and did his master's in public administration at Harvard Kennedy School, was with the said business school at University of Oxford, and was also with scholarship. So he has these broad areas of specialization, specific degrees, and also trying to connect in terms of the broad engagements in Indian public debates and discussions. He has been extremely prolific on several areas of promotion of entrepreneurship and development. With his expertise and knowledge, I am so privileged to welcome you, Surjeet Kumarji, today in this discussion. We are also very privileged to have very accomplished panel today with Ambassador Dr. Bhaskar Balakrishnan, who has been deeply involved in India's debates and discussions in terms of innovation and science diplomacy. Mr. R. Rashmi, who is Distinguished Fellow at the Energy and Research Institute, was part of the delegation from Terry to Glasgow and spoke at different panels. He has been articulating our position on access to technology in the climate change. Leena is a leading and authoritative voice on civil society articulations on access to medicine. As she introduced herself, she is Global IP Advisor and Regional Head of MSF Access Campaign. Dr. Srinivas, who has already joined. He's a managing director, and we would also be joined in by one of our legal luminaries, young and very bright mind, Dr. Yogesh Pai, who is assistant professor at National Law University of Delhi. But before all that, Thomas Pogge to the concept of impact fund, how he thinks this whole books and publications are largely in terms of the health sector, but applicability of his concepts and ideas are relevant to various sectors as we would explore today. I'm also Secretary of Science and Technology, Médecins. Warm welcome to you, sir. Let me now request Professor Thomas to give us the idea. Thomas, you have the floor.
First of all, thank you very much to all of you for being here. I've worked with Sachin Chaturvedi for well over a decade on this project, and India is by far the most important country for it. I think that with Indian support, we can make this happen. Without Indian support, most likely not. So again, I'm very grateful that you all are here and are willing to discuss this with us. Innovation is uniquely important. Human beings are the one species that employs innovation, both in order to make progress over many generations, which has been spectacular, especially in the last few centuries. And also, innovation is our defense against shocks, against sudden things that happen, like, for example, the COVID pandemic. Now, innovation is expensive. We want more of it. We want to reward it. And the way in which we are currently doing that, globalized in 1995 through the TRIPS agreement, is through product patents. We give innovators a temporary monopoly, which allows them to be free of competition and to charge high markups for the use of the innovation, either through licensing fees or by selling their products at a high markup. This system of rewarding innovation has its advantages, but it has also three important drawbacks. The first one is that it is insufficiently sensitive to externalities. Often innovations are not only valuable for the potential buyer, but they have third-party effects. For example, if I drive an electric car rather than a diesel car, then I get a small health benefit, as does my family, but 99.99999% of the benefit goes to the rest of the world and future generations. People are often indifferent or not mindful of these benefits, and so tend to ignore them. And that means that these innovation incentives insufficiently incentivize innovations that have large third-party effects, positive effects, and also insufficiently take care of their diffusion. A second important problem is that the innovation,
one of the best guys
of the innovation,
talking on climate change.
The diffusion of the innovation is hampered by these high markups. If we reward through high markups, then innovators have an incentive to innovate, but often the innovation doesn't spread properly because some people will simply not use it. If one kind of power plant that is modern and green is more expensive than another, then people will simply not use that particular power plant. They will use the old dirty technology because of its price advantage. So it's really not very intelligent to have wonderful innovations there, but then to make them expensive so that their diffusion is delayed or is hampered. This, of course, is particularly painful in the area of poor populations. Poor populations are not so much unwilling to deploy the innovation as they are unable to. This is a problem that is most acute in pharmaceuticals. We have wonderful medicines, and these medicines do not reach poor people because they are sold at prices that often exceed 1,000 times the cost of production. And so millions of people die, millions of people suffer because they cannot afford to buy medicines that could be mass produced for ridiculously small amounts, are being mass produced for these low amounts, but are then priced much higher, well out of reach of people. And that gets me to the third problem, and that is that innovation typically leaves out problems that are specific to poor people. Why? Very simple, because to poor people, you cannot sell innovations at very high markups. They cannot afford these high markups, and so why innovate for them? And this then leads to the famous problem that we have more pharmaceutical research on hair loss than we have pharmaceutical research on malaria, schistosomiasis, and other health problems that are typically heavily concentrated among the poor. So that is the problem that you probably are all familiar with, the problem about the existing innovation incentives. What we are proposing is to add a second type of incentive to the ones that we already have. And these incentives would be impact rewards. The way we envisage it is through creation of sector-specific impact funds. These would be funds that operate within a particular sector of the economy, like the pharmaceutical sector, the agricultural sector, the education sector, the green technology sector. And they would feature a series of annual reward pools. Every year, there would be a big pool of money that would be available for distribution. Innovators in that sector could enter an innovation for participation in the distribution. And each year, the distribution would take place by dividing the pool of money according to the impact that the registered innovations have achieved in the preceding year. So if you're a pharmaceutical innovator, say, you register your new medicine with the Health Impact Fund, and then for the next 10 years, you will get a share of the annual pools that corresponds to your share of the impact achieved by all the registered pharmaceuticals in that same year. Now, of course, there is a catch. The catch is that if you take that reward from the impact fund, then you cannot get the other reward, which is the monopoly markup reward. You have to sell your product at a non-profit price, either by making it available for generic production free of charge, or by simply selling it at your own cost of production. So there is a choice, and that means that the impact fund would attract, in particular, those innovations that are high impact and are not so profitable on the ordinary patent track. And these are innovations that are particularly suitable for poor people, so neglected diseases, for example, or green innovations that are especially needed and useful for poor people, and also innovations that have very large positive externalities. Again, green innovations whose benefits mostly concern third parties would be heavily rewarded by the impact fund approach, but make little money under the patent system. So that's the very basic idea. Let me say one more thing that is relevant, especially to India and the global South, and that is that impact funds would foster capacity building. So think of pharmaceuticals, for example. If Indian pharmaceutical innovators want to compete in the area of cancer, let's say, it's going to be very, very difficult because the big Western companies have already spent billions and billions of dollars researching that class of diseases that affect rich people or affluent people. But with regard to the diseases that would come into focus with a health impact fund, Indian innovators do not face that kind of disadvantage. These are not diseases that anybody in the West has ever studied very carefully. And so here, Indian innovative companies could very easily compete, especially also because they have a patient population right at their doorstep, and so could run clinical trials much more easily than Western companies could. And that in turn would allow the jump starting of an innovation industry in India, in pharmaceuticals, in green technologies, and so on. These companies, these innovative companies, would start in tackling the problems that are specific to poorer populations. This would be made financially viable through impact rewards, and they would then gain the capacity to compete even with regard to other classes of diseases or other kinds of innovation that are more relevant to rich people. So this would also help overcome the great gap in innovation capacity between North and South and help the South catch up with the North. So I stop here and really, really look forward to what you all have to say about this approach and idea.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Thomas, for giving us a comprehensive overview. Before I hand it over to our chair for the session, let me also acknowledge presence of Professor Ts Pardo from Bhutan. He's former minister in Bhutan, and I'm so glad to see him on the screen today. Warm welcome to you. He has been a prolific writer, a thinker and commentator for regional cooperation in South Asia. It's a great pleasure to see you, sir, here. A warm welcome. I also acknowledge presence of Dr. Sandhya Iyer from Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Quite a few familiar faces. It's a great privilege to have all of you here. Let me now hand it over to Surjeet Kumarji, Honorable Member Rajya Sabha, to lead the panel discussion now after this initial statement from Thomas and setting the broad context within which we would be discussing for another few minutes that we are having in this session. Surjeet Kumarji, over to you now.
Thank you very much, Professor Chaturvedi. Thank you for a very, very kind and a generous introduction. It's a great honor to be invited to chair this 2021 annual Global Justice Program conference organized by RIS and Yale jointly. To be frank, I'm the least qualified to speak on this topic. Forget about chairing this panel, and I think being a politician is probably my only qualification to be invited to speak on this topic here today. Thank you, Professor Pogge, for that very holistic. Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. So for that very holistic and comprehensive introduction on the topic, which is a very, very, I think, relevant topic and an interesting one, particularly from a policy point of view. Professor Chaturvedi spoke about the balance between the interest of the innovator and the need of the society, and IP rights today are recognized as the most well accepted incentive, and also has been universalized through the TRIPS agreement. whether it's for access to medicine or access to technology or access to knowledge. IPR have become the global, determinant of innovation incentive. But oftentimes we see that IPR tilts the balance in favor of the innovator at the cost of society. Now, what are the social cost of this tilt? What are the social cost of the monopoly through IPR? And are we able to create, or should we create in the first place, better mechanisms of incentivizing and supporting innovation? Now, many alternative ideas have been proposed and even tried in many countries and societies, whether the prizes, competitions, patent buyouts, open source innovation. But I think IPR remains the dominant incentive for innovators. But the core problem, why we have not been able to find a better solution, is because innovators need an incentive that's legally binding, that's credible, that they can trust, and the mechanism should be. And the mechanism should be as good, if not better, than what's available under the IPR regime. Now, in the Indian context, at least we can say it with some degree of confidence that the IPR regime has not worked really well, because the IPR regime itself has not been very robust and strong as compared to advanced nations, and hence the IPR mechanism has not served as a very strong incentive in the Indian context. Now, this leads to what Professor Pogge spoke about, the sectoral funds, the Health Impact Fund or the GIFT, Green Impact Fund Technology. So these are the sector specific funds that I think need to be explored when we are speaking of impact-based innovation, impact-based incentives. Now, if we speak of the HIF, the Health Impact Fund, it rewards incentives and innovators in multiple ways. First of all, it helps in increasing the coverage and outreach of the medicine. But I think the biggest benefit of this model would be what I would say, the negative incentive, punishing products and innovations for quality defects or for not being able to reach the desired impact. So that's equally important. And I think any policy framework needs to take this negative incentive aspect into account. Now, green technology has been spoken of. And this GIFT can be a great model for meeting the climate change challenge. But my concern is, as of now, the discussion seems to be fairly academic, and it has, of course, been explored and debated by civil society and by some of the practitioners. But I think the policy landscape in the country, or at least the political fraternity, is still very inadequately prepared to understand the implications of this, this alternative models of rewarding innovation. And hence, I'm looking forward to this panel to explore some of these questions from a policy point of view. So I would really want the panel to focus on 3 or 4 questions as we discuss this critical topic today. The first and foremost would be how to adapt the impact-based incentives for incentivizing innovation and enhancing access to medicines in India. Professor Pogge has spoken about malaria and some of the diseases which are largely affecting the low strata population. So that would be one question for exploration today. The second topic which I would love to hear more about is, if we do create such a fund, what are the potential sources of funding? And are there implications, regulatory implications? Do we need to involve the Reserve Bank of India, the central bank, or do we need to involve, the finance ministry? And are the central banker or the ministry mandarins adequately educated enough to guide us on the regulatory aspects? And the third is, will it affect or will it be brought under the larger umbrella of Atmanirbhar Bharat or the Make in India project that Honorable Prime Minister has been talking about, and Startup India, Make in India are some of the flagship schemes which are promoting innovation in this country. So can these impact-based incentives be brought under the larger innovation policy of the country? And finally, if we are to develop an Indian version of impact-based innovation model, incentive model, then what should be the guiding principles? And can we draw some of the lessons from the best practices abroad and customize it to the Indian context? So I think I'll stop at that. I would now request the lady in the panel, Ms. Leena Menghaney, to start the discussion, and I'm not sure if I'm supposed to.
Thank you.
Or Professor Chaturvedi?
Yeah, no, that's perfectly fine. I think
Okay.
You have already invited Leena, so let Leena begin and start the discussion today.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Surjeet, for inviting me first. I was still thinking my thoughts through. But, I'm going to put it in context, of global events. We are in the middle of two major global events. One is climate change and the other is the pandemic. Now, if you look at the pandemic, there are three things that are standing out, which are also reflective of the past 2 or 3 decades on access to medicines and pharmaceuticals and vaccines. What you really see is that what is available is often not adapted to the needs of developing countries. mRNA vaccines that need complex cold chains is a classic example. What you see is what is available is extremely expensive. For example, if you look at some of the vaccines that are being sold to the Africa Union, they are at higher prices than what they are being sold in the United States or the EU. And what you really see is the concentration of manufacturing capacity in certain countries. And that impacts all other countries who are heavily dependent on a few countries for supply. Lastly, I would say is this, what the pandemic also highlights is the difference between the haves and the have-nots. I would like to say that we've treated many neglected diseases, communicable diseases, and MSF now even treats cancer. And what we see is a stark difference in availability and accessibility and adaptability of medical products between high-income countries and the rest of the world. And I include upper middle-income countries in that. So right from, the kind of formulations that are made, the kind of cold chains that we need, the kind of drugs that are wanted in developing countries or, low income, middle income and upper middle income countries, to what is happening today, which is an outright situation of medical apathy. So where you are clearly seeing high income countries dominate the resources, vaccines and medicines now for COVID-19. So that's the backdrop that I'm going to put. The second thing I wanted to say something about Indian innovation, and I've been an observer of Indian innovation for many, many years. When I first joined Médecins Sans Frontières, we were negotiating for the malaria RDT with a company called Orchid. And now you see that, Indian companies and Indian industry based on funding from Indian government is actually developing capacity to develop TB drugs. You see them in the pandemic actually develop the entire regulatory dossier, do the clinical trials as a new product of vaccines. You also see something that perhaps no one has noted and actually looked at, which is you see Indian innovation like TrueNat play a huge role in mitigating the kind of acute shortages that the rest of the world has faced on COVID-19 testing, coming from Indian companies, competing with world leaders on COVID-19 testing. These are PCR platforms that were built for other diseases and adapted to COVID-19 by Indian companies. So you can see innovation right there. You can also see CRISPR technology coming from the public sector and being then licensed out to, the WHO CTAP entity. You also see Indian government invest heavily in the mRNA vaccine, and we'll hopefully see a few candidates next year. So all of this is happening. Indian innovation is moving very rapidly. Lastly, I wanted to say this is that if you look at Indian innovation, I think perhaps people don't watch the market. I come from a family of, Sindhis, and we watch the stock market very carefully. And one of the things you noticed is that you look at chemicals and you look at organic chemistry, Indians are right up there, right up there. With that kind of background, it is a matter of time where Indian companies will catapult themselves into dominating, drug development as well. All of this, of course, comes on the bedrock of public funding. So if you look at, today, the monoclonal antibodies that Indian companies have developed, often the first projects were funded by DBT, mRNA vaccine funded by DBT, CRISPR technology funded by DBT. So you are seeing a lot of science and innovation being funded by the Indian government. Now, where are we going with the situation on access? Considering that we have significantly quite a bit of progress from India on innovation. The world is an interlinked world, and as in MSF, we can see this, that, while one country does something, another country's scientists develop something else, and everyone is collaborating and developing different products. So you can't just simply say that we can do our own innovation and we are not dependent on anyone else's innovation. So therefore, if you are dependent on someone else's innovation to do your own innovation, you need two major important reforms in the global system. One is a very sound licensing system. So currently what happens? You want to make the mRNA vaccine, you need certain technology. You go out to ask Moderna, for example, what the Africa Union, the hub in South Africa, which has been set up by WHO, you go and ask Moderna, and Moderna will tell you, or Pfizer will tell you, we won't give you our technology, we won't license our technology. So point blank refusal to license. Now, if technology is important, and we have to trade technology with each other, countries have to trade technology with each other, and companies have to trade technology, and entities and institutions have to license products or technology or molecules, and the list could go on, processes, drug delivery systems, then you need a system where there cannot be a right to refusal. What we are looking at is a system which has failed, which is why South Africa and India put in the proposal to waive all intellectual property. Because essentially, the bedrock of the problem is the lack of licensing by a few entities who actually have bought up a lot of the innovation in the market. So they actually would be richer than any health impact fund and have capability to buy up all innovation. Now, if you look at a company like Roche, a Swiss company driven by a Swiss family, they pay far more than what the innovation is worth. So they're not actually innovating themselves. They have the strength of making monoclonal antibodies. They buy up the next generation of monoclonal antibodies from smaller entities. They pay far more, and they're very happy to pay far more, because if you look at the bottom line of Roche, they have dominated the world of monoclonal antibodies. So I just wanted to say this, that this is the backdrop of where we are talking, what kind of reforms we need. Number two is this, that where does India lack? And I think this is the three most important reforms I want to talk about in India. One is the accountability of research funding. So if the government of India is funding research, which sectors are you funding? Which products are you funding? I can give you an example. I work on HIV and I work on TB. One of the most important tests is the TB LAM test. Now that technology itself has not been developed in India. It could have been if, say, the CSIR or DBT could have invested in it. Who looks at what is being developed and what is not being developed? So is public health needs driving the kind of funding that is required? So could we have a dialogue between those who treat and the Ministry of Science about what we really need for treatment in developing countries? And TB LAM is a classical example. You could use the same technology for other diseases. So I just wanted to simply say this, that you need more accountability. You need transparency. So one of the key issues with any kind of, giving out funds is, do you know the cost of R&D? Do you know the cost of production? Now, world over, the issue of transparency is being debated. And I think India is not going to be alone, where in a situation often we don't know how much funding has been granted, direct, indirect. So what kind of tax subsidies have you given, land, cheap land, electricity, the whole package, right? And we do not know the cost of production. Often it's hidden, so you do not know. So you have to do your own calculations. So you, in fact, you don't know what to pay. You don't know how much markup is there because there's no transparency in the system. So what are we going to do about transparency? So this is one big major governance. Number two, I would like to talk about, without taking too much time, is the fact that India is developing majorly on innovation, but it doesn't have clinical trial platforms and does not have platforms for data transparency. One of the key reasons why people question Indian innovation is that the data is not available for scrutiny by the scientific and medical community. So you would have to create a situation where Indian innovation is trusted the world over if you could improve transparency and if you could improve the clinical trial platforms and data. And lastly, I wanted to say this, that the intellectual property system, after the 20 years or 15 years we've had of it, we can't go back and say that, all we need is neglected disease drugs or communicable disease drugs. Today, MSF treating, we need insulin. We need affordable insulin. We need drug delivery. We need delivery devices for insulin, which are much better than the current forms that say you get in the public sector. You need the insulin, which is analog, so that, people have a better quality of life. The same person may have HIV and may need antiretrovirals, may have TB, so might need TB drugs. So in India is personification of the world in low and middle income countries, where you have to tackle communicable and non-communicable disease. And the current intellectual property system unfortunately requires reform, because if you look at the current situation with cancer medicines or insulin, we are going to go through a situation where most governments will not be able to pay for it. So access issues are not limited to neglected diseases. Any solution cannot just be targeted at neglected diseases. It needs to look at the larger situation that middle income countries like India are facing. And the last thing I wanted to say, thank you so much, Surjeet, for reminding me the 3 minutes are left. The last thing I wanted to say is this, that, India has played a tremendous role in delivering innovation to the world. Unfortunately, the world only recognizes one model of innovation, which is the blockbuster model. And the blockbuster model is based on, I would say, price gouging, which is you extract as much as you can. And if we start paying those prices through any fund, we just can't afford to run those funds. So if we are to, look for a health impact fund, or even in the, an impact fund for environment, we need to look at how companies are pricing their products and how are we going to pay for those products. So ultimately it's taxpayer money. The bottom line is we, the people everywhere in the world, pay for innovation and pay for the medicines. So I think the accountability issue in India is very, very big. And I would just say it's been a tremendous experience as Médecins Sans Frontières working in India on access to medicines. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leena ji. Thank you for acknowledging, the role of public sector in bringing out technology innovations in India, and of course the role of DST and then CSIR and accountability, of course, is a huge concern, and you have suggested dialogue between the government and the innovators, and sound licensing system. Of course, India has been one of the pioneers in advocating waiving of this IPR. Transparency, of course, is very critical. So thank you for those very, very important suggestions. Next, let me invite Dr. Bhaskar Balakrishnan to share his insights.
Thank you, Chair. Let me start with a few remarks on the present IPR system. Is all well with it? No, certainly not. This agreement on TRIPS of 1995 grants a monopoly period, usually 20 years. But this is often extended by evergreening, making minor changes to the patent to keep it going for a longer time. The prices of products are much higher than the production costs. The justification is that you have to recover high costs of R&D, but often R&D is supported by public funding. So that needs to be more transparency here. Now, product patents on which India took a beating. In fact, we were threatened by the US with Section 302 in 95. People have forgotten that period. Product patents discourage research and discovery of alternative and cheaper processes and new knowledge creation. So it's a bad thing that you mark off a certain area of research and knowledge with product patents. And so nobody else is encouraged to do research on cheaper methods and create new knowledge. There is a misuse of the IPR system for patenting traditional medicines such as neem and turmeric. We were victims of this. Move to patent genes which occur in nature, and medical methods like surgical procedures are sought to be patented in some countries. Now, there are new technology areas such as AI and gene therapy and issues of eligibility for patenting knowledge, which are now being hotly discussed. There is no incentive for research in important areas that cannot result in patents and high profits. Green technologies, SDG-related technologies, traditional medicine and knowledge, which can be exploited for useful products. The very high costs of some products, such as CAR T-cell therapy for rare diseases, is another result of this system. Now, TRIPS flexibilities are there, but they are very difficult to avail of in practice, such as compulsory licensing, etc., especially when they are opposed by patent holders. The Indian and South African proposal for a temporary waiver of COVID-19 medicines and vaccines has not been approved in the WTO even after 1 year. So what is the answer to all this problem? Well, we have to look at public funding through both push funding, which is done by NIH, for example, and pull funding, which is through a system of awards and prizes for R&D. This has had some success. Now, the Health Impact Fund is really a form of pull funding. Another method is voluntary grant of exemption from patent royalties in certain situations and circumstances, such as in COVID-19. That is, the patent holders voluntarily grant exemption from royalties, and that to enable access to medicines. So HIF funding could be used to support this kind of voluntary grant of exemption. Now, how do we incentivize R&D into such badly needed areas, and what circumstances? Well, clearly a new and innovative means of rewards is needed. There are some possibilities like crowdfunding, public funding of R&D, philanthropy through Bill Gates Foundation, etc., which of course can fit in with the present IPR system. The Health Impact Fund is a novel approach. It's a principle of rewards based on measurable impact of the invention. It can be applied for green technology, for achieving the SDGs, and it could have wider applications in many fields where there are unmet needs, such as access to education, etc. There is a need to convince stakeholders about the validity of this approach. The industry, the governments, civil society, and let's not forget the IPR legal fraternity, who actually make a lot of money in this IPR sector. How do we grow and raise such funds? Well, philanthropy, public money, financial markets, endowments, crowdfunding, etc. These are all approaches one can look at. In India, we could use the CSR funding, which uses 2% of gross profits from industries. In the case of green technologies, we could look at emission pricing mechanism. In other words, that would automatically fund the GIFT through a collection of some prices on emissions. Those who emit, they pay a price. Now, I'm not talking about a carbon tax, so don't throw up your hands in horror, but something like that. So this could be a profitable investment. The whole impact funds could also be a profitable investment for those who put in money. If it is structured in a certain way, you could get a good return on it also. There are some practical issues. How do you measure the impact and how do you make the payments? There should be standard indicators which should be agreed on. There should be a claim process which should be agreed among all stakeholders. There should be independent agency measurement of indicators and claim verification. And you should have a dispute settlement system which is efficient. You could have advance payment and a payment through some kind of bankable instruments, some kind of bridging finance mechanisms. And of course, the tax status of HIF claims is very important. The tax incentives could play an important role. And government recognition awards for achievers. That also has a good effect on participation. So with these remarks, I will stop here and I look forward to listening to the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bhaskar. Thank you for sticking to time. In fact, you have ended before your prescribed time. And I think the CSR funding suggestion is an excellent one, because there are certain activities which are permitted under the CSR framework today, and research and development is not one of the permitted activities. So I really think this is something which our legislators can highlight at the relevant platforms. And crowdfunding or voluntary grant of exemptions are some of the other novel suggestions that have come from you. So, and misuse of IPR, you spoke about the misuse of IPR and gave the examples of Neem and Haldi. So, traditional knowledge, traditional know-how, these are not leveraged enough when we talk of innovation, at least in the Indian context. So, many valuable suggestions. Thank you, Dr. Now, let me invite Mr. R.R. Rashmi to share his valuable insights. Mr. Rashmi.
Thank you very much, Honorable MP. Let me first comment on what Professor Pogge had said in the beginning about the impact fund. And I entirely agree with him that it is not enough to reward the innovator. We need to take into account other factors, the externalities. And particularly in the case of environmental problems, externalities are extremely important and they need to be taken care of and fully accounted for. And the cost, obviously, is the major consideration. So in any regime which seeks to reward the innovator, we need to look at the final impact on the society in terms of the cost, in terms of diffusion of technologies and the adoption. And so his points are extremely valid, very well valid. So what he has suggested is that we need to create an impact fund to be able to push the innovation. And while rewarding the innovator, we need to also increase its adoption. I agree with this, but I like to share two other perspectives on this. Climate change is slightly different from health sector. Here we focus not on the products, but on the process. Ultimately, the climate change, the resolution of the global problems like climate change revolve not around specific products. And then there are a number of technologies available for a similar outcome. For example, energy efficiency. It's a known fact that there are a number of technologies which can achieve the same result. So it's a question of essentially of what kind of technologies you want to adopt and where do you want to actually put it in. So the question is of how do you promote the adoption of a particular technology? Is it by rewarding the innovator or is it by rewarding the actual user? So we have a different model here. And I must say that the point that public funds will play a very important role is very well accepted. We cannot rule out the role of public fund in any scheme of technologies which looks at its diffusion adoption and deployment. Now, climate change is a classic problem where technologies are available. In fact, there are two kinds of technologies which are required for climate change. One is the technologies that are available, but they are not sufficiently adopted. They are commercially mature, but their application is not on a wide scale. For the example which I will give you is that of industrial decarbonization. Energy efficiency is easy, but in the case of industries like steel, cement, pharmaceuticals, or chemicals, we have to adopt technologies that decarbonize in the interest of climate change. These technologies are available. I mean, after all, if you have to replace oil and coal in these industries as the high for generating high-grade heat, you have to use either natural gas or hydrogen. So those technologies are there. But the question is that of the cost. So how do you bring down the cost of these technologies so that their adoption becomes faster? So that is the challenge for technologies which are required in the case of industrial decarbonization. So this is a case of technologies which are available, but they need to be scaled up. So scaling up is the real challenge here, not the innovation and not the reward to the innovator. Do we have sufficient examples where we can do this? Yes. In fact, let me cite the example of the Montreal Protocol on ODS, ozone depleting substances. The technologies were there. The ODS depleting substances had to be replaced by other chemicals which were non-ODS. The issue was that of the adoption of the non-ODS technologies. And the international community agreed on a multilateral fund under the Montreal Protocol, which rewards the project proponents to the extent that they reduce the ODS, the application of ODS substances and replace them by non-ODS substances. They're rewarded to the extent of the incremental cost. And that model has succeeded. I mean, in fact, the Montreal Protocol is one of the exceptional environmental treaties which has actually resulted in closing the ozone hole. And the result is the support which was made available to the users, to the project components, and also to the innovators through a multilateral fund like this. So that is the first case. And I would say we must adopt a similar model for industrial decarbonization, which is the immediate challenge for us now. We need to create a global fund or a national fund, and that will obviously have to be created with a pool of resources drawn both from public as well as private sector. There are some global platforms, which are moving in this direction, and I think we should support them. The other thing is that of the technologies which are not commercially mature. That is the second case of technologies. For example, electrolysis. I mean, if you want to produce green hydrogen, you need to bring down the cost of electrolysis. Again, electrolysis is not something which is not known. It's a known technology, but it is not commercially mature. You have to develop these technologies to be able to provide to the industries and to the users at a large scale. So the scale is always the problem. And I would suggest that there are, apart from creating a global fund or a national fund for development of, supporting the development of these technologies, we need to do two other things. One is, in case of climate change or any other environmental problem, it has always been the regulation which has actually initiated the change. The market has never been an initiator of change in the field of environment problem resolution of the environmental problem. It has always been the regulation. So regulation must always be the case. Similarly, in the case of, for example, biofuels. Now, India has a regulation that must achieve 20% of blending of biofuels in the petroleum and diesel. And how will it happen? It will happen because if we are able to mandate this and aggregate the demand. So raising the scale, either through demand aggregation methods or simply by financial instruments like reverse auction, which we have done in the case of LED or in the case of solar panels. We have been able to employ these reverse auction methods, financial instruments, and bring down the cost of the technologies, available technologies or commercially not mature technologies can be converted into mature technologies with the use of these financial instruments or these innovative measures like demand aggregation. So I would stop here, and I would suggest that in India, we should use some of these regulatory measures, a combination of regulatory measures, along with funds sourced either from public or private, to be able to support this kind of demand. I'll just cite one example of adaptation fund, which is there. Recently, the government of India has come up with a production-linked incentive scheme, which is also some kind of public funding of those technologies which are required to be scaled up. So scaling up is the real issue in the case of technologies in climate, and we need to employ a different menu of options rather than one single option for this purpose, for which there are a number of examples already. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. You rightly pointed out that scaling up is the real challenge. If you want to promote usage of a particular technology, then you have to scale it up. And how do you do this? Do you reward the innovators or do you reward the users? And rightly, you have pointed out that in the Indian context, it's often the regulator rather than the market which is responsible for scaling up a particular technology or making any technology commercially mature or viable. You mentioned about the PLI fund. I think it's one of the commendable initiative by Government of India at this point in supporting industry and enterprise and with some public funding. So thank you for the insights. Now let me take the opportunity to invite Mr. S. Srinivasan. But before I give the floor to Mr. Srinivasan, I would like to acknowledge the presence of Mr. S.N. Tripathi, a distinguished bureaucrat of the Odisha cadre, a retired bureaucrat now. I think I saw him as one of the participants. Okay, the floor is yours, Mr. Srinivasan. Mr. Srinivasan?
He's not on mute, but we can't hear him. We can't hear you, Mr. Srinivasan. Maybe by the time you sort out your connection, we can, Chair may consider inviting Dr. Yogesh Pai.
Yogesh Pai. Dr. Pai, if you could step in at this point and make your remarks as we wait for Mr. Srinivasan to sort out his audio issues. Dr. Pai, may I request you to make your remarks, please?
I think yes.
Okay, thank you.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello, am I audible? Yeah, the host was not allowing us to unmute. I think that's the problem with Chinu Srinivasan also.
Please come in. Please come in. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Chinu can also go in now. I think Chinu must also have been. Do you want me to go first? I can go first.
Since we have invited Dr. Pai.
Okay. Wonderful. Okay. So am I audible to everyone?
Yes.
Am I audible to everyone?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. And Thank you, Honorable MP, for inviting me for the panel. It's really an honor to be on this panel with many distinguished participants and Professor Pogge himself, sitting on the panel with us, who in last year's piece in the Hindu had a very hard-hitting and illuminating piece on how it is the right time to shift the gears on innovation, particularly because of the COVID-19 crisis. And in that piece, he made a very important point that if there is a time to think about changing models with respect to how R&D is conducted and how currently the patent system does not link it with the social impact, I think this was the right time. But what interestingly has happened during this last 1 year and 1.5 years or so, 18 or 19 months roughly now, is the fact that there are 132 vaccines under clinical trial, and there are some more number, I think around 180 or 90 in preclinical trial development. And largely this has happened because a combination of pull and push factors. We know that. The pull factors definitely being the patent system, and the push factors being the high amount of high intensive R&D that was pushed in by by the US government, by the European Union, and including India, for example, where we had definitely helped and partnered. There was a bit of partnership between the government and the private sector to come out with some vaccine platforms. This was apart from the amount that we spent on advanced market commitments in relation to procuring the vaccines. Now, I have a couple of my initial comments on the impact fund. One, definitely, there is no doubt in my mind that the brilliant side of the impact fund is that it relies on a market model largely because it relies on the efficiencies generated in the private sector largely, where the innovation is done by the private sector, if not exclusively, but at least to a large extent, and then the health impact fund, when it is registered, when the innovations are registered, is going to what you call provide the right incentive as such. Well, the usefulness of this model when compared to other non-market models, like, for example, R&D subsidies and, public funding to some extent, is that the cycles of overcompensation and undercompensation can be avoided to some extent, precisely because the indicators and the benchmarks for incentivizing are based on the social impact that is created. Naturally, if there is a high social impact, which means the medicine or the technology is of very great value in the context of climate change, we can think about the same thing, and the rewards are going to be commensurate with what is being the impact. But the question that I have for myself as an academic, and also to my co-panelists, and if Professor Pogge can also answer it, is the following. There are two of them. Number one, I hope I'm audible to everyone, right? Because I'm not in Delhi currently, so there is a little bit of intermittent internet issue. I hope I'm audible. If I can just get a signal that I'm audible. Okay, yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, sir. So there are two following questions or comments that I have for myself and for the panel. See, the IP system, the patent system largely has a robust signaling function, and that is an ex-ante signaling function because the IP system relies on the market for rewards. Naturally, because if you fail, the market is not going to reward. If you succeed, then there is no limit to it, right? So the signaling function is very clear to any innovator that upon success, the reward that one would achieve is basically what is driven by the market. And what is driven by the market is an ex-ante signal, which means clearly they know what, if they succeed, that there is not going to be any barrier on their ability to appropriate returns from the market. How does the social impact, how does the impact fund, which is an ex-post kind of evaluation, consider the question of this strong signaling function? Because if you want to replace the IP system in relation to certain technologies, particularly those that relate to developing countries or neglected diseases as such in the context of medicines, then would this system provide adequate ex-ante signaling to innovative companies to innovate in this space? Because the problem is of opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of capital in R&D is different depending upon at the point of time you put it, and by the time you make something out of it, you realize that there is going to be a real huge market, or in neglected diseases if there is no market. But be it as it may, as on the day you want to put the money, would this impact fund cater to, and how far it would cater to and replace the strong signaling function? Definitely the IP system has little value in the context of neglected diseases. We all know that. And that's why how the signaling function is going to be as robust is one question. Second problem or a comment that I see is on the platform value problem. Now, how does the impact fund cater to the value platforms that have social impact beyond the specific disease or beyond the specific product area? For example, the mRNA. One of the reasons why these two companies are not willing to cooperate with the rest of the world, is particularly because they think that this platform has potential beyond the vaccines. And this is true to some extent because companies like Sanofi, other companies have moved on to do research on mRNAs, dumping their vaccines, research, because they now think that vaccines anyway, it's under production. There are so many other companies, there are non-mRNA vaccines. So let's move on to cancer disease. Let's move on to other kind of important, sectors. So if a platform has value beyond what it can contribute to a specific product, how does the impact fund cater to such kinds of technologies? Now, I raise these questions, these are the broader questions, but we have certain specific problems, with reference to the innovation ecosystem in India. Naturally, we all know that in India, the highest amount of R&D is done by the public sector and not by the private sector, right? There is a huge mismatch. I think it's around 70-30. The statistics in 2018 and 19, showed clearly that divide. Now, one of the things that has happened in the past, is let's look into our history, right since 1950s after independence. One of the first issues was with reference to getting penicillin technology. Now, if you look into how we got penicillin technology in India, Merck was producing globally, and there was Pfizer and there was another company, Glaxo. Glaxo and Pfizer did not want to, do a full technology transfer to Indian companies, local companies. Merck was willing to do it with a 15-year royalty of $150,000 per year, and that was too much at that point of time. So Prime Minister Nehru himself took the final decision not to do it with a private company, but with the WHO UNICEF funding of 1.2 million. But the unique thing about that point of time was that WHO had capabilities and technical expertise, within the organization, wherein one of the technical experts who was also the representative of the WHO who was handling this fund knew actually how to do it on the ground, because he was an ex-private company employee and he had those kinds of expertise. So the Indian government got the technology, did it in India. That was one success story of Hindustan, Antibiotics Limited. But we all know what happened to Hindustan Antibiotics since the 1970s. It has been struggling, and now there is a recent parliamentary report of at least we should retain such companies because it has strategic value. That's what is the discussion going on. So in India, we have typical problems of access to technology, which means basically at times getting patents waived off, etc., do not simply work, because we actually need know-how and process transfers. So how do we overcome those kinds of barriers? if there is a health impact fund, naturally the technology itself is going to be given. That is going to be much easier. That's a very positive outcome of the impact fund, because there is a technology transfer in itself. That's what I understand, because it's not just simple patent licensing or voluntary licensing of patent, but ultimately it's a voluntary model. So if we really think in terms of India, finally, there were 4 questions that we were required to address. How do we adapt the impact-based incentives and incentivizing? I think the real question is, how much is the government willing to put in money? Because currently we put in 0.7% of our GDP in R&D, and that's very, very low when compared to the rest of the countries. I mean, this is often said. And what the question of financing R&D that we currently do will be the same question that will end up in the impact fund. So that question is no way any different. Second is, if the fund must be set aside or created in implementing the health impact fund in India, what are the potential sources of funding? I mean, the potential sources of funding, naturally the DBT, DST, etc. Because this funding, I don't think would be any way considered differently from other kinds of R&D funding, extramural or intramural funding in India. How the impact fund based incentives will affect IP and innovation policy in India? IP and innovation policy, in terms of its outcome, will definitely be impacted if those 2 problems that I mentioned, the signaling, ex-ante signaling function and the cumulative technology value problem, can be resolved. And suppose they are resolved, then, and if the markets start reacting to the impact fund and starts contributing, yes. So then, we can possibly, think about, IP system is just a complementary form of, system for incentivizing innovation. And I don't think the IP system itself is going to be impacted. There are different outcomes that have to happen. I think I will stop at this, and then we can have the speakers and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Yogesh. Thank you. Thank you. I think you have, I think you have flagged 2 very, very important concerns regarding the ex-ante signaling for the impact fund and the platform value problem which the impact fund vis-a-vis the IPR regime has to answer. And 0.7% of GDP is being spent on R&D is certainly not acceptable. And I think enough noise should be made and enough sensitization has to be made so that the government wakes up to this reality of spending at least a couple of percentage point of India's GDP on R&D. Thank you, Yogesh. I think we have about 12 minutes left for Q&A. I see a large number of questions in the chat box. Let me start with Mr. Falguni Sundaram Biswal. The question is, one can also...
Mr. Chairman, we are... Vasan is connected.
Oh, okay. Is he connected? I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Sorry, Mr. Srinivas. Please go ahead. The floor is yours. My apologies.
Mr. S. Srinivasan, can you please try again your mic? Is it now connected? You have been unmuted already. Mr. Srinivasan?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you now. No. Yes, you have to come closer. No. There is something wrong somewhere.
No, we can't hear you.
Mr. Srinivasan, I think...
We can't hear you. There's something wrong, Chair. I think back to you.
Yeah. So I think we should take some of the questions because unfortunately we are unable to hear Mr. Srinivasan. the first question is from Mr. Biswal, Mr. Sundaram Biswal, where he wants to know about the role of government and businesses and non-profit sectors in developing skills for the future for a changing workforce. Okay. He's not specific about what skills he needs for the changing workforce, but I would let the panelists, answer and interpret it the way they would like to.
Yeah. So
anyone from the panel can. Yes, Ms. Leena, please.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to my initial response to saying that Indians could very well be the next monopolist on chemical technology and organic chemistry, and this is where they actually have built an immense amount of skills. If you look at what is happening between the pharmacologists, the organic chemists, and India has built actually quite a good, robust grounding for actually, building a chemical and pharmaceutical industry. However, I would just like to highlight that when it comes to, the area of clinical trials, I think we need to do a lot more to build platforms for clinical trials. And this is where, you would require people to be trained, not just on how to conduct clinical trials, but also on the ethics of clinical trials, how to take consent, and to make sure the data is managed in a way that it is acceptable globally by medical and the scientific community. So I think these are two areas where, of course, India sort of leads on organic chemistry, but at the same time, we really need to do more about how we run clinical trials. Yeah. And what kind of protocols we actually approve. So, the capacity on the drug regulatory part, the Drugs and Cosmetics Act and the DCGI's office, for example, one of the reasons why there have been so many questions on some of the innovations for COVID-19, even though the world would love to use them from India, is that, we didn't think ahead about what we really wanted to do and how the data would be required globally and not just in India. So I think that's where I would sort of, build skills, put more human resources within the, drug controller's office and the DCGI's office. And particularly in making sure that we run the trials in an ethical fashion, but also in a way that our data is organized and transparently available to those who need to scrutinize it.
Yeah. If anyone wants to add to this? Or we can move to the next question. There is a question on the box regarding artificial intelligence. AI is getting ready for business, but are businesses ready for AI? I'll let the panel decide who wants to take this.
Yeah, I think we didn't think of covering AI in this panel, but I just wanted to say that, we need a regulatory framework for AI. AI is technology that's going to be used not just in health, but everywhere. So it's a counterintuitive way of looking at it, is that we're going to see, we need more frameworks for how we use AIs better. So I think we are a long way off from that.
Yeah, I did mention that the issue of eligibility of AI for patenting, something which is still being discussed. So that's still an emerging field. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on AI and intellectual property. I mean, most jurisdictions have rejected patent applications on AI technologies, except Australia very recently, where they, the question in AI is whether AI can be the inventor. And if it is an inventor, would the patent system that has historically recognized the human as an inventor be replaced by, the AI? And that kind of philosophical question has, been not answered in all most jurisdictions, except recently in Australia, where they said that historically there has been no bar on, the interpretation of inventor as a human. But there are other emerging questions on AI, I think, that requires a different panel discussion altogether.
Yogesh, can you add a bit on the legal aspects of AI with regards to innovation incentives?
Well, see, the question of innovation incentives for AI is as good or as bad as others. Now, one of the things that people frequently argue, and there have been discussions going on in the WIPO forum also on AI since last year. There have been 5 sessions of the WIPO that contribute to this discussion. One of the broad questions they have asked is whether creation of AI technology needs any incentives. Well, if there are companies who invest in AI technologies, definitely they would need incentives. If there are companies who are involved in platform technologies like two-sided platform markets, like Facebooks and Googles of the world, then they can always have incentives derived from services, from advertising, etc. And then they can contribute to their AI R&D investment, wherein they can decide to give away these technologies and their IP for free. And that happens usually in the marketplace because markets push certain companies to forfeit their IP. There is a beautiful Harvard Law Review article on this, on why markets give away IP, because the markets themselves push it. So in that situation, definitely, IP is not a question. But if there are companies whose business models are essentially aligned towards licensing of technology, then be it AI or any other technology, they would require what you call incentives. Now, having said this, if the AI itself starts creating what you call inventing and innovating, that's where the real crux is, then definitely, there would be high level of competitiveness because there would be many systems who are going to do the same thing. In such a situation, I think the question of really incentives is hard hitting. And I think the business models are going to shift towards, and the markets are themselves going to push towards AI technologies more and more becoming freely available to the public to consume.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just like Google Maps, just like Gmail that we get for free. Yeah.
Right. There is a lot of use of AI, for example, in screening molecules for applications. And in fact, it's quite possible that AI will result in new molecules being found for health applications. In that case, although the legal position is still emerging, but I think clearly the user of the AI is the one who applied the artificial intelligence, and he would presumably be entitled to patent the new molecule. But it's still an open issue.
Professor Chaturvedi, a lot of members of Parliament have expressed a desire to know more about AI. So may I request you very humbly assign a responsibility on your shoulders to organize, if possible, a webinar or a physical meeting for the MPs, because we are congregating in Delhi in 2 weeks for the winter session of Parliament. I think this would be profusely helpful for the MPs.
No, on both, Sujit Kumarji, on AI, but also on IPR and access to medicine. Right. I think we can do 2 panels for honorable members, and we would be extremely privileged to connect the whole dimension because of the vaccine Maitri and other initiatives. We can definitely provide you inputs on both. And I think Professor Jairam Ramesh also suggested a similar desire. So we would be very happy to provide inputs to all the MPs. Definitely. Point well taken. I also wanted to mention, now that I have floor, there are quite a few questions. Maybe I think, Sujit Kumarji, if you find 1 or 2 important, and then just go round the table to all the panelists, as we are already reaching close to time. Thomas is very kind to give some more time, but I think it's getting since delayed in Delhi. What I would suggest is to pick up few points from the chat box, whatever you consider appropriate, and then we go just around the table for final comments by speakers, and then a concluding remark by you. And before that, if Thomas wants to comment, we can invite Thomas for his remarks, and then closing remarks by you.
I think by and large we have covered most of the questions in the box, Professor Chaturvedi. So I think let's go to the panel and starting with Ms. Leena and the same order as we had the introductory remarks. Let me invite Ms. Leena to give her final remarks, followed by Mr. Bhaskar, Dr. Bhaskar.
Yeah, so I would just like to highlight two things, that there are several projects around the world that are looking at more open forms of research and development, looking at delinking the cost of R&D from the cost of the final product. And delinkage is a very important concept that India has actually supported in international negotiations. Perhaps, Mr. Bhaskar is aware of it, that India has been one of the foremost leaders in suggesting that the R&D system, it's high time that the R&D system be delinked from the final cost of the product, which is what the intellectual property system does. Number two, I would like to highlight is this, that, what COVID has sort of highlighted is that you can actually have R&D coming from public funds. And if you look at the data, it's stunning. Over 90% of R&D has been, the funds for R&D have come from the public sector too. Number three is this, that I would like to, sort of bring the attention of policymakers to the problem of exclusive contracts. So, if you look at two things today, if you look at what happened when India had to, stop exporting the Oxford vaccine, which was, a very important vaccine, not just for India, but for the rest of the developing world. And in that context, I would like to sort of highlight that, we could have had, it was a lost opportunity for India. We could have not just one producer, but several producers. And, the Indian government did step in with Covaxin and did do precisely that. But, Oxford and the others did not do that. So I think we really need to open or, move away from the exclusive model of licensing. And I would like to then, go back to where, I've seen a lot of public institutions in India do non-exclusive licensing. And I would point out to the CRISPR technology that is now being non-exclusively licensed by, CSIR and your scientists and colleagues over there. And I just would like to congratulate India on that. Lastly, I would just like to say that it's really very important that India resume its vaccine exports at the highest level possible. I know that there are discussions about the booster vaccine, but at this point of time, the Africa Union is barely making it to the 10% mark for the vaccination. So before we think of boosters, we also need to look at sorting the supplies out for many LDCs and other countries. And in that context, I would like to say that we really need to look at holding companies like J&J, who promised us millions of doses every month, but have not delivered, accountable in the Indian Parliament. So I'm going to just stop here and hope we have better interactions in the future on science, but also on access to meds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leena. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Bhaskar, for your final remarks.
Thank you. I will make a couple of points. One very important point is this question of R&D intensity of GDP, which in our case is 0.7%, and largely on the hands of the public sector. In fact, the Rajya Sabha had a committee on COVID itself recommended that we should boost this to the world average, which is 1.7%. But I would say that we should be even more ambitious. We should look at something in the range of 2 to 3.5%. South Korea presently is the highest, around 3.5% of GDP. The other critical indicator is the number of researchers per million population. So there again, we fare very poorly compared with even developing countries such as South Africa and Brazil. So that's another area we must improve our performance, the number of researchers per million in our ecosystem. Of course, many of our bright researchers go to other ecosystems. These things are very clearly being made the focus in the new Science, Technology and Innovation Policy 2020, which is on a draft stage and should be approved quite soon. And they find a place also in the new education policy. So these two policies will play a very important role. So I think you're very right. I think we need the support of our legislators to raise the research intensity of GDP to something like 2%, which is the UNESCO benchmark, and also researchers per million. Now I'll come to the question of exclusivity. You know, in our FDI policy, there was the infamous press note 18, which says that a foreign investor, when he enters into a technology collaboration with an Indian player, he cannot negotiate with any other player in the Indian market. So we ourselves actually limited the scope of the foreign player to supply the technology to more than one Indian partner. He could not even set up a separate venture. Fortunately, press note 18 is gone. So this has led to something, you know, more liberal framework. So the point I'm making is sometimes the exclusive arrangement is a misguided idea of protecting the Indian partner from competition. This, I think, is counterproductive. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bhaskar. I think I can't agree with you more on the the R&D spend. It should certainly be increased to at least 2% of India's GDP, and I would be definitely taking this up as a special mention or as a 0 hour during the upcoming monsoon, the winter session. Now I would like to request Mr. Rashmi to give his final remarks.
And thank you very much. I'll like to make, in the interest of economy of time, just 2 brief points. One is that we need to create funds both at the global level as well as at the national level to be able to fast track the technology transitions in the area of environment and climate change in particular. At the global level, I think we have a good example of what I cited earlier, the multilateral fund under the Montreal Protocol. And it's a good example which we should also adopt under the UNFCCC. The Green Climate Fund model has actually failed. It hasn't really succeeded. And that is not the best instrument for supporting technology transitions. So we need to adopt what the multilateral fund has done, and we need to create an alternative fund of that nature, which is similar to what Professor Pogge has suggested in terms of impact funds. At the national level, the strategy needs to be a little different. In addition to creating a pool of resources drawn from public and private sources, we need to create appropriate business models. Business models which can incentivize the users and the industry to adopt technologies which are either at the stage of development or which are not yet commercially mature. And the key here would lie in using the innovative financial instruments like reverse auction or demand aggregation. But this will succeed only if you have the regulatory support, if you have the regulatory mandate. So what I'm suggesting is that at the national level, you need to create a fund which would incentivize the industry, but this must happen in an ecology of regulatory mandate.
Thank you, Mr. Rashmi. Now I'd like to request Mr. Yogesh Pai to give his final remarks.
Thank you, Honorable MP. Yes, thank you very much. I'm audible, right? So my final remarks would be this. One of the things that happened during COVID-19 was that in spite of the funds that were given by the public through the funded schemes like Operation Warp Speed or other kinds of mechanisms, you can clearly see from the contracts between the pharma companies, private companies, and the government that the provisions, for example, of the buy-all, the margin rights were excluded through regimes called as Other Transactions Authority in the US. Some of the contracts clearly show that companies were really concerned that their IP is going to be taken away if they receive the public fund. And the government agreed, saying that they won't want to take the IP away. And as a result, we see that there are some vaccines in the marketplace now. So now we should really ask a very fundamental question. Why did the government allow that kind of a transaction? The government perhaps understood the competitive constraints that were in and allowed it. But we also see the results in terms of inequity today. We know the causes and consequences. Now, the simple issue in relation to vaccines One of the things that I heard was, for example, Oxford, AstraZeneca have not licensed widely, but they have nice license non-exclusively. I think around 15 countries are currently producing AstraZeneca's vaccine with 25 plants, at least until March. That was the record. Now, I think what we can do in the future perhaps is to look into these other models and try and see what the competitive constraints are. If governments are not able to exercise the power of eminent domain at the time of entering into contracts, and later if they want to do it, naturally, when the IP is, held by these companies, there would be these conflicts. So if those conflicts could be resolved ex ante at the time of making these contracts by understanding the implications of, how much would be then required to be funded, because the amount would then be substantially higher perhaps. And then perhaps there would be cycles of overcompensation and undercompensation, which maybe we want to avoid. So there are these complex set of economic questions that we would want to answer, if we want to rely on these alternatives that are being currently proposed. Thank you. And thank you one and all.
Thank you, Dr. Pai. And lastly, but certainly not the least, may I invite Professor Pogge to give his insights, to share his insights.
Gladly. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you all very much. This was an incredibly illuminating session, and I will go over that in great detail with the whole team to learn a lot about the context of innovation in India and how we can make this idea fit the specific needs of India and other developing countries. So thank you very much for your incredible expertise. I want to use my minutes just very briefly to respond to the remarks that Yogesh made specifically on the impact fund model, because I thought they were very interesting challenges. And one challenge was the challenge of market signaling. What is the predictability that companies have in inventing specifically for an impact fund? And here I think we can decompose that into two different issues. One issue is the stability of funding. And that's a huge challenge, right? One of you mentioned the shameful failure of the developed countries to live up even to their little promise that they made at Copenhagen in 2009 about the $100 billion. And of course, we can't have that. If we have an impact fund, the funding has to be absolutely ironclad, so that innovators who invest money and effort into inventing something have assurance that they can then register it with the impact fund and get appropriately rewarded for the impact. Now, the other side of the equation is, can they make predictions about the impact? Once they know that whatever impact they achieve will be rewarded, they want to have some sense of what the impact will be. And I don't think that is going to be extremely difficult, right? You obviously have the problem of potential competition. If I develop a malaria remedy, there's the possibility that a competing company also develops a remedy that can take away market share from me. But that's a problem that companies are well used to, because that's a problem that exists under the existing system just as well. What I can anticipate as an inventor is I can anticipate the need that is out there and the potential that my innovation can achieve in terms of reducing the disease burden, in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions or whatever it may be. I know how good my innovation is, what my innovation can do. And I also know what potential need is out there that I can satisfy by selling my innovation at a not-for-profit price. So I don't think that this is an insuperable hurdle. The other thing that I must confess I hadn't thought about before is the problem that what I want to call ancillary impact. I mean, the example that you gave was fantastic, was the mRNA technology that is used for a particular product, but which may have implications for all sorts of future products. And I think the obvious solution to this problem is to do this, that you say, whatever is rewarded under the impact fund model is no longer eligible to be rewarded under the monopoly model. So if you have a new technology, mRNA, let's say, then you can register either the entire technology, or you can register simply that particular vaccine that you make with this technology, and then retain the remainder, the general idea of mRNA, under the monopoly patent regime. So the only thing that you are giving up is your monopoly pricing power for this specific vaccine, and you then claim impact rewards for that, but you retain the broader idea and can then choose with regard to that. Let's say future vaccines under that same technological model, you can choose again and again whether to register any particular vaccine or else to avail yourself of your monopoly patent powers. The last point I want to make is I want to attract you to the idea that this is not just something great for India. I know India is the size of a whole world, of a whole universe, but there is beyond your borders the rest of the global south. And I think of India as being basically a kind of leader of the global south, a model, an exemplar, and a unifier, a potential. And this is something that Professor Chaturvedi has so wonderfully done in the last many years, this idea of South-South collaboration, with India as the main catalyst of this collaboration. And one way in which that feeds into the impact fund idea is this way, right? If you have the impact fund, an impact fund created over a whole bunch of countries in the global south, Brazil, Nigeria, South Africa, Indonesia, and so on, then you double or triple or quadruple the funding available. And that means you can develop more medicines, more green technologies, more innovations. And at the same time, you also increase the number of beneficiaries. So by doubling, you quadruple the impact. By tripling, you ninefold the impact. So the impact fund idea has this incredibly powerful feature that it grows, as it were, to the square rather than simply linearly in proportion to the money that you put in. So if India could be the catalyst for creating an impact fund that would assemble large chunks of the global south and a few of the nicer countries of the global north, I think we could get an incredibly powerful mechanism going that would first and foremost help poor people to get access to the technologies that we all are used to and take for granted every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pogge. Thank you. Wow, it has been such a rewarding evening for me. Honestly, there has been such a deep learning and insights for me personally, and I'm sure it has been for everyone. For someone who knew so little about these issues and these challenges, there has been a lot of food for thought, and you have all ignited my curiosity to explore and to read more on these topics. Professor Chaturvedi?
Yeah.
I think I'll hand over the floor to you to make your concluding remarks, and then I think we can end this session.
No, thanks a lot, Surjeet Kumarji. I think the discussion has evolved so well, and so many ideas have been stimulating, and I think the policy relevance has been there. Probably we would have to, in India, think of a mechanism, Surjeet Kumarji, which we would very much like you to raise in the appropriate platform where you are, to see how India can actually create platforms for incentivizing innovation. And the point that I raised in the beginning of delicate balance, because India has poor people, India has people who can afford high-end technology, but we have to create a balance and we have to see the convergence. So how, without creating monopolies, we can create mechanisms for incentivizing innovation, I think is important. And from that point of view, if technology is beneficial, if it is inclusive, then we can as well think of a fund which can then incentivize and provide India the leadership that is needed for the region. because we can't expect, as Honorable Minister from Bhutan is here with us, Professor Ts Pardo. They have been talking in terms of and looking forward to India's supporting hand in COVID vaccine crisis. We helped and we couldn't cope up later. So we need to see how we enhance the ecosystem, how we enhance the larger footprint of India so that Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas becomes the reality in innovation, science and technology, and we take everyone along in the process. So from that point of view, Surjeet Kumarji, your leadership in Parliament would be extremely important for us to take this idea of innovative fund mechanism to be created, and we take this concept in terms of how we can accumulate, as Professor Bhaskar Balakrishnan just now mentioned in the chat box about CO2 technologies and similar costs, overhead costs to be borne by the government, by the mechanism, and we reward market mechanisms which are creating effective technologies. So with these words, I once again thank everyone and would like to invite my very dear colleague, Dr. Ravi Srinivas, who has been doing the heavy lifting for getting events and speakers together. Professor Ravi Srinivas has been himself a very, very substantive writer, commentator, and thinker about technology and policy connect in terms of access and equity. And Surjeet Kumarji, he has published extensively in this area. Let me have the pleasure of inviting Ravi to propose vote of thanks on behalf of RIS and of course, the Health Impact Fund program at Yale. Ravi?
Thanks, TG. I mean, it's my pleasure to propose vote of thanks. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Thomas Pogge for working with us in organizing this and then for giving his insightful thoughts as well as his comments to this. I mean, in the sense that we have been discussing and then talking about Health Impact Fund, now GIF for quite some time. So this webinar is one more step in knowing more, discussing more, and then thinking in terms of practical action. I would like to thank Mr. Surjeet Kumar, Honorable MP, for his support and then for chairing this session and then for also making very relevant, important observations. We have noted them down. We will be in touch with you regarding them. I thank Professor Sachin for his excellent support and also for joining us for this today despite his other commitments. And I particularly like to thank our esteemed panelists who are themselves very established experts in this field, Ms. Leena, Dr. Rashmi, Dr. Bhaskar Balakrishnan, Dr. Yogesh. And unfortunately, Mr. Srinivas could not join due to some technical issues. Otherwise, it would have been real pressure to add him for the simple reason he heads a unit which is making low cost therapeutics and low cost medicines as generic producers. So his insights would have been very much valuable to us, but then still we would like to, we will be in touch with him, get his views and then share it with the other panelists as well. Thank you once again for your support. We look forward to having you all again another meeting webinar. As you all know that RIS has been working on technology, IPR, and then Science, Technology, Innovation, Society Connect for quite some time. So this is part of our larger work. I'm quite sure that we will be able to connect with you again on another occasion. Thank you all. Good night.